Welcome back to the discussion, Cybersecurity, Protect, Detect, and Respond, sponsored by Microsoft and CSRA on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guests today are Susie Adams, the Chief Technology Officer for Microsoft Federal, Marlon Andrews, the Deputy Chief Information Officer for the National Archives and Records Administration, Guy Cavallo, the Deputy Chief Information Officer for the Small Business Administration, Jay Huey, the Director of the Secure Cloud Portfolio at the Technology Transformation Service at the General Services Administration, and Dr. Matthew McFadden, the Cybersecurity Director for CSRA. As we went through that first segment, we talked a lot about this hybrid environment. And I'm going to start with Susie and just do two things. Let's make sure we know the definition of hybrid environment so we don't confuse our listeners and viewers. And second, what's the difference when you secure one over the other? I mean, we all think of on-premise. We all think of you just lock the door of the data center, put up a big fence, and then make sure no one taps into your pipe. But walk us through a little bit of the basics, I guess.
Sure. So, I think from a hybrid perspective, I think, to me, in the way that I define hybrid is that you're going to have assets that live inside your data center, and I think the federal government's a little different than maybe some of our commercial counterparts. You might have some that are in a contractor's data that's in a contractor's data center, and you're going to have data that might live in multiple cloud providers. All right. So hybrid now could extend to 5 or 6 different locations easily, not to mention where you're backing up your data and providing redundancy. Right, across your portfolio. And so that is a complicated world to manage from a network perspective. You might have applications that are running on bare metal. You have virtualized applications, probably in 1 or 2 virtualization technologies. And then you're going to have IaaS, SaaS, and PaaS apps, right, living in commercial clouds. And so how do you manage that hybrid world? Where does the handshake happen between your IT department, right, and your CISO and what you're responsible for managing, and what the other pieces of your network or your data center that are now virtually extended to the cloud are managing? And so what we find is that's the biggest challenge, right, is how do you marry that, and what's that handshake look like? And I think, one of the bigger, when we talk about you really need to look at identity, or you really need to look at security differently, it doesn't mean that you forget everything you've done before. You still have to do all that. You still have to manage things from a defense in depth perspective. You still need to do best practices for locking down your data center. Now you need to actually add another layer of protection on top of that. Right? And that's really at the application layer and looking at signal from all these places, not just NetFlow data anymore, not just the network. Right? You need to look at all the signal that's coming in, right, and see the anomalies that you can gain from that. Because today, phishing attacks are the norm. Right? There's now, you need to apply new technology that's out there today on top of your additional security stack to help you find that anomaly, right? So for example, in Office 365, just out of the box in the service, and we're not the only cloud vendor doing this today, we're extending capabilities to help you basically block phishing attacks. So if I receive an email in my inbox and it has a link on it, even if the link looks valid, even if the email looks valid, if I click on that link, it goes to a detonation chamber and gets blown up, right, before I can go anywhere with it, right? That's just, so now we take the human component out of that, right, and just get rid of that particular attack vector altogether, right? And those are the types of investments that you're seeing all the major cloud vendors really embrace. We've spent about $10 billion adding new capabilities, right, into our cloud services so we can help you manage that hybrid environment. Again, not saying that you should only use cloud tools. It's another layer of protection on top of the tools and the portfolio, the security portfolio you already have in place, right? And so people can't, they can't think about things as they used to from a traditional IT perspective where you have a single point solution, right, that's going to do everything for you, or that a particular security vector security risk needs to the technology needs to be implicated in a certain way to mitigate it. The bad guys are looking for new ways to infiltrate, and they find them, right? You need to be as innovative in your application portfolio for security as you are being in your technology that you're buying in the cloud.
So please tell me your marketing folks have some kind of cartoon of an email going into a detonation chamber and blowing up. I've got to see that if you have it.
I haven't seen it, but I'm sure one does exist. It just never went public.
Let me turn to Matthew real quick. React a little bit more to what Susie was saying as we're talking about the extending the security piece. I've heard many times that the defense in depth is dead. and we should give up on defense in depth, and it's really going to happen at the data layer, at the application layer. But how do we strive to get those both balances? Because as someone said earlier, just assume breach.
Yeah, so I think defense in depth definitely still applies. It's just kind of a matter of how you apply it. Obviously, every single customer environment is different, and it depends on their mission, the applications that they're supporting. As folks move into the cloud, as Susie was saying, the cloud service providers give you the tools there to help secure environment. It's just a matter of kind of knowing how to deploy them. So, one of the things I think is very important is, education and training. So, as we're moving to the cloud, it's still that same on-premise IT staff, managing a lot of these environments. So they need to know, what is that security checklist? What are those guidelines to help, secure those various aspects of services? As we mentioned, a lot of the tools and services are going to change a little bit. You'll see a lot of, virtualized firewalls, and you still need to define, how do you do web application security? How do you deploy an IPS? How do you do packet logging? You can't go out and just, plug into a switch and see all the packets running across, the virtual network nowadays. So it's also helpful to kind of, define, what are some of those tools and technologies available to help improve your security posture, which really leads to that, defense in depth across the board.
And I know that the many years it was vendor in depth, it was defense in depth. So I think that is still applicable. But I think, as you both said very well, it's how do you extend that into the cloud? So let me turn to Marlon a little bit. When you listen to what Susie describes, hey, it's not just at the network level, it's got to be at the application level, it's got to be at the data in transit layer. How's NARA kind of pulling all this together?
So the way I look at it is you have to take a holistic view of all your assets. And I remember one of the major issues that I ran into is we had an audit on our master system list, and they were telling us, well, you should take all your cloud assets and make it separate. And I'm like, no, because we don't manage that way. I have to manage across the entire enterprise because most of my on-premise systems talk to my cloud system. So I have to see that one dashboard that shows my whole network and take security from every layer. And that's why I agree with Matt that defense in depth still applies, because you have to look at it in every layer and how is it going to work and how is it going to interoperate with each other. So I definitely agree that you have to look at the whole hybrid view and you just can't break it off into segments.
And I think sometimes when you think, well, let's break this, let's just look at the hybrid by itself, you have the data in transit issue. And does that come up when you guys are as you're setting up your network and saying, okay, this is something that we can make, this data can be public, and we want to make sure people can get it easily, while this data remains private and
yeah. So you have to build out your boundaries and your enclaves to make sure you separate based on the level of security that's required for the particular asset that you're looking at.
Jay, one of the things that comes up several times is the controls issue, and FedRAMP is trying to get that, as you said, about the 80-20 rule. Let's get you 80% there, but then the agencies want to come back and say, well, what about that control? What about this control? How's FedRAMP and how's your work with the Secure Cloud portfolio working with agencies to kind of understand where they need to really focus their efforts?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I love the title of the show, right? Detect, protect, and respond. But there's also like another one, which is learn. I think Susie and Matthew both touched on that, which is the threats are always changing, right? The technologies are always changing, and there's this constant shift that we always have to respond to. And so from the FedRAMP perspective, right, the 80-20 is we believe that agencies should know who their users are and what permissions they have. That's identity and access. There's always a set of controls. You can go down the rabbit's nest of how those are implemented, what risks those have, and I appreciate it when agencies have the time and money to do that. But around confidentiality, integrity, and availability, there's one that we don't talk about, which is value, right? Speed to market, speed to value, speed to mission, however you like to phrase that. What's the friction that I'm doing, right, when I review all these controls and when I'm kind of learning in so much in depth versus trusting and building this hybrid environment. So we try and really have those in-depth conversations with agencies about where they really need to focus based on risk. There's this kind of hybrid risk, and about what they need to focus on learning, right? The new ways of doing identity and data protection in the cloud as opposed to kind of the infrastructure levels. I think that's part of the shift and the learning that has to happen. I wish I'd been around when agencies went through the shift from, everyone had a desktop PC to laptops, right? Because that really was the original hybrid cloud, right? It was on-prem, but it could go home with the employee, right? It could go to the car, it could get lost. And I know know agencies have made that transition successfully, so I'm excited for this one.
And it seems like a lot of people get that data at rest, but not the data in transit. Susie, jump in.
So one of the things you just said, protect, detect, respond. I think one of the things that that agencies really need to focus on is now detection. Before we were very good at protect and respond. Right? Something would happen, we protect our boundaries, and then we know how to respond to it. But sometimes that response came 256 days after that the infiltration occurred. Right? Now we need to spend and get much better at the detection in that assume breach mentality. And I think that's the major mind shift that needs to happen is you need to spend time actually on the detection and looking at all the signal versus just responding when it happens. And when you respond, it's a lot more than just unplugging from the network. Yeah. Right? You actually sometimes want to let those bad guys stay in there, find out what they're doing, and then tune your detection and your protection so that it can't happen again.
Marlon, jump in.
So our CISO has done a great job creating a cybersecurity framework, and the protect, detect, and respond is in there. But in the beginning, you called it learning, we call it identify, and at the end is recover. So after you respond, how do you get back to the steady state to where you need to be? So NARA is working on that, and we're implementing that over the next year, and that's our key focus when it comes to cybersecurity.
Guy, jump in, because you guys, with as you say, doubling of the agency, getting more people involved, you got to protect the data, and a lot of data could potentially be in transit. So talk a little bit about what you're hearing.
Yeah, one thing I think that we've all highlighted is whether you're hybrid or what percentage, it really doesn't matter, but if you don't take that enterprise view of security, and I've had the luck of being at 2 federal agencies leading their cloud efforts in this last year, and I saw it both in a very large agency and SBA as a smaller one. We need to do the basics. We need to make sure encryption is turned on. We need to make sure data loss protection is turned on. I've talked to a lot of other agencies, and if you look at their software bills, they're paying for these things, and they're not turning it on. The identity management. One thing that I saw when we turned on our cloud security console on our internal premise equipment, one of the things I saw was there was an alert on server password, so I drilled down into that, and it told me that 3 of our servers on our network had easily guessable passwords. So I drilled down further into that, and 2 of them were the default password, and one was the name of the server was the password. So and talk about hybrid, one of those servers was actually from another shop in SBA that has their own IT shop. So not only are we hybrid of on-prem and the cloud, we also have separate IT groups within SBA that were in our own hybrid. So again, the security tools from the cloud showed me things on premise that none of our on-premise tools were reporting. And my other favorite thing is firewalls. I love seeing the staff throw up firewalls, and then I ask them, what ports are you opening? And you never get a list. So I firmly believe that we have agencies that probably have 3 or 4 firewalls in a row that contradict each other and finally let everything through. So you feel you're protected, but you're not. So that's something I'd love to see GSA step in and help us with that, Jay.
Check your firewalls.
Yeah, check the firewalls.
Jay, can you take that down as a to-do list?
Got it.
Yeah, I think it's more of a DHS thing with the pen testing. Matthew, let me turn to you for a second, because one of the things that keeps coming up as everyone talks is identity management, access control. We've talked about identity management for years. I think HSPD 12, Homeland Security Prisoners Directive 12, which required the PIV access, is turning, if I do the math right, 13 years sometime in 2018. We're still not there yet, but now with the cloud, that adds another layer of complexity. How does that work? How do you get the identity management piece in place? Again, I know we talked a little bit about this. Is it easier with the cloud?
Yeah, I would definitely say it's easier in the cloud. I think one of the most basic things, and you just going back to what Guy said, some of the basics is just multi-factor authentication. And you may have read in some of the very recent breaches, that is an issue. So a lot of the cloud services providers, provide the ability to add multi-factor authentication very, very easily as an identity management service. So can I use Authenticator, or can I use a text message for a passcode along with the password? Just simple password protection is not enough in today's threat landscape to secure much less anything really. So having those additional tools available is very important.
And Susie, it seems like multi-factor authentication has gotten so much easier. I made this example just the other day where when you go to the gas station and use your credit card for gas, they added that second factor right away, which was your zip code. But it seems like with texts to your phone and other types of things, Microsoft has added that second factor into your cloud efforts as well.
I mean, there are a variety of different ways to do it. Even inside the government right now, there's a lot of talk around derived credentials, and so we've integrated the ability to support derived credentials and all of our tools in our operating system, but also in the cloud. And so you really there's a variety of different ways to implement multi-factor authentication. And I think when we look at PIV and CAC, I mean, I know there's a lot of work right now going on in DoD around how do we actually support derived credentials so that it's not, hey, I've got to carry this card and this card reader and attach it to my phone to be able to do multi-factor authentication, right? We can now do a variety of different things, and we have a variety of different technologies that our customers that are using Office 365 or Azure can now just take advantage of. And I think that's really where the federal government needs to advance itself a little bit, is in how it looks at identity protection and the ability to extend multi-factor authentication to new mediums, right? Because the PIV and CAC, while I still in Microsoft, we all have our card that looks like a PIV or a CAC card, but I no longer stick that into my laptop to get access to data or get access to the cloud. I can use any device I want. The technology is just smart enough now to say, hey, look, if you're logging on from a non-managed, non-domain joined device and you want to access critical corporate data, you won't have access because we don't know if your device is protected. We don't know if it's infected. Even though you've provided a multi-factor authentication mechanism, we still don't trust, right, that you should have access to this data. All of a sudden, I go to a domain joined device, and it knows when I provide those credentials that device is protected and then it's secure. And that technology exists today, right? It's not rocket science. The agencies can deploy it and then lock down and give more granular access based on the security posture of the device and the person that's accessing it.
Yeah. That's a great point. I think there's a lot of efforts, big thinking going on around the next generation of ID management, because I think CAC and PIV, while good for 2007, maybe not working today. All right, let's take a quick break. You're listening to the discussion, Cybersecurity, Protect, Detect, and Respond, sponsored by Microsoft and CSRA on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM.